I trusted him with my deepest secrets. He was my therapist, my safe space. But when I walked into that $1 million engagement party and saw him at the altar, I realized the man who'd been inside my head had also been inside my bed. And his fiancée had no idea. Before we dive into this insane story, hit that like button if you're ready for a wild ride. And subscribe because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. You know that feeling when your world completely falls apart? When everything you thought you knew about yourself crumbles in a single moment. That's where my story begins. I'm Sarah, and 6 months ago I was a complete mess. 28 years old, fresh out of the worst breakup of my life, and drowning in anxiety that felt like it was suffocating me from the inside out. I'd wake up every morning with this crushing weight on my chest, like someone was sitting on me while I tried to breathe. My hands would shake when I had to make phone calls. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function like a normal human being. My friends kept telling me I needed help, professional help. So I did what any desperate person does. I Googled best therapists near me and prayed my insurance would cover someone decent. That's how I found Dr. Marcus Reed. His profile picture showed this incredibly handsome man with kind eyes and a warm smile. The reviews were glowing, life-changing, brilliant. The best therapist I've ever had. His practice was in this gorgeous high-rise building downtown, the kind of place that screamed money and success. I remember thinking I couldn't afford someone this good. But somehow my insurance covered it. Looking back now, I should have questioned why. Walking into his office for the first time felt like stepping into a different world. Everything was pristine: mahogany desk, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And then there was Marcus himself. God, he was even more attractive in person. Tall, probably 6'2", with perfectly styled dark hair and these piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He wore expensive suits that fit him like they were tailored specifically for his body, which I later learned they were. But here's the thing, he was completely professional. Kept appropriate distance, never said anything inappropriate, always maintained those clinical boundaries you expect from a therapist. He had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. When I talked about my childhood trauma, the way my father abandoned us when I was 12, Marcus would lean forward slightly, his eyes never leaving mine, and I could feel our session had run long. We'd been talking about my relationship with my mother, and I'd had a breakthrough about some childhood patterns I'd never recognized before. It was getting dark outside, and Marcus suggested we continue our conversation over a glass of wine. To help you process everything, he said. Sometimes informal settings can be just as therapeutic. I should have said no. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this wasn't normal, wasn't appropriate. But I was so grateful for his help, so desperate to keep feeling understood that I agreed. He poured 2 glasses of expensive red wine from a bottle he kept in his office cabinet, and we sat on his leather couch instead of in our usual chairs. That's when everything started to shift. The professional mask began to slip, and I caught glimpses of the real Marcus underneath. He started sharing personal details about his life. How he'd grown up poor, how he'd worked his way up from nothing, how he was in a complicated relationship with someone who didn't understand his ambitions. He moved closer to me on the couch, and when our knees accidentally touched, he didn't pull away. "You're so different from other people, Sarah," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Most people are so shallow, so concerned with material things. But you have this depth, this authenticity that's incredibly rare." I felt special, chosen. Like maybe, just maybe, the feelings I'd been suppressing weren't as one-sided as I'd thought. What happened next was a slow, intoxicating slide into something that felt like love, but was actually manipulation at its most insidious. Marcus started texting me between sessions, just to check in, he said, to see how I was processing our conversations. The messages were innocent at first, professional even, more frequent. He'd text me good morning messages, ask about my day, share funny observations about his other patients without naming them. I felt like I had a direct line to this brilliant, caring man who understood me better than anyone ever had. Then came the suggestion for informal therapy sessions. He said some of his most successful treatments happened outside the clinical environment, that sometimes patients needed to feel more relaxed and natural to really open up. He suggested meeting at upscale restaurants, quiet coffee shops, even art galleries. Environmental therapy, he called it, experiencing healing in different contexts. I was conflicted but also flattered. Here was this successful, gorgeous man wanting to spend extra time with me, to help me heal in ways that went beyond traditional therapy. I felt special, chosen, like I was his most important patient. And honestly, after months of feeling worthless and broken, being the center of someone's attention felt incredible. Our first informal session was at this intimate Italian restaurant downtown. Marcus looked different outside his office, more relaxed, more human. He wore dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my rent, and when he smiled at me across the candlelit table, my heart practically stopped. We talked about my progress, about my goals for therapy, about my dreams for the future. But we also talked about other things. Movies we loved, places we wanted to travel, what we'd been like as children. The conversation flowed like wine, natural and intoxicating. When he walked me to my car afterwards, he hugged me goodbye. It lasted maybe 5 seconds longer than it should have, and I could smell his expensive cologne. Marcus would look at me differently, smile in ways that felt intimate rather than professional. And our informal meetings became more frequent, more personal. It was during one of these evening sessions at his office that everything finally happened. We'd been talking about my fear of intimacy, about how my ex had damaged my ability to trust. Marcus was sitting next to me on the couch, closer than usual, and when I started crying about feeling unlovable, he reached out and touched my face. "You're not unlovable, Sarah," he whispered, his thumb wiping away my tears. "You're incredible, beautiful. Any man would be lucky to have you." And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, like he was testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, when I actually kissed him back, it became more urgent, more desperate. We ended up tangled together on that expensive leather couch, crossing every professional boundary that had ever existed between us. Afterwards, lying in his arms in his dimly lit office, I should have felt guilty, confused, worried about the ethics of what had just happened. But instead I felt euphoric. This brilliant, successful, gorgeous man wanted me, had chosen me out of all his patients, out of all the women in his life. "This is complicated," he said, running his fingers through my hair. "My situation, it's complex. But I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah. You've gotten under my skin in a way I never expected." He told me about his long-term girlfriend, how they'd grown apart, how he was planning to end things but needed to wait for the right moment. She's connected to my business. I have to handle this delicately," he explained. "But I want to be with you. I need you to trust me on this." And God help me, I did trust him. Completely. Blindly. Our affair continued for weeks. We'd have our regular therapy sessions, maintaining the pretense of professionalism, and then afterwards we'd fall into each other's arms like teenagers. Sometimes we'd meet at hotels. Sometimes he'd keep me after hours in his office. The secrecy was intoxicating, making everything feel more intense, more forbidden. But there were red flags I was too infatuated to see clearly. He never took me to his apartment, always claiming it was too risky, that his girlfriend might show up unexpectedly. We never went anywhere public together where we might be seen. And when I asked about timelines, about when he'd actually end his other relationship, his answers became vague and evasive. "These things take time, baby," he'd say, kissing away my concerns. "I need to handle this properly. You wouldn't want me to hurt someone unnecessarily, would you?" The worst part? My mental health, which was supposedly the reason for all of this, actually started getting worse. The secrecy was eating at me. The uncertainty about our future was triggering my anxiety in new and horrible ways. I was becoming emotionally dependent on Marcus in a way that felt increasingly unhealthy, but I couldn't see it at the time. I'd stopped hanging out with friends, stopped focusing on my career, stopped doing all the things that actually made me feel good about myself. My whole world had shrunk down to revolve around him and the scraps of attention he gave me. The beginning of the end came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I'd arrived early for our session and let myself into his office with the key he'd given me. He was on a phone call, speaking in hushed tones, and didn't notice me come in. I was about to announce myself when I heard him say something that made my blood freeze. "The party is going to be perfect, Victoria. Everything has to be absolutely flawless. This is our moment to show everyone what we've built together." Victoria. He'd never mentioned anyone named Victoria before. And the way he was talking, it didn't sound like someone planning to end a relationship. It sounded like someone deeply in love, planning something important with their partner. After he hung up, I casually asked who Victoria was. Marcus's face went white for just a split second before he recovered his composure. "Oh, just a business associate. We're planning an event for the practice," he said smoothly. Too smoothly. That's when I started paying attention to things I'd been ignoring. Like the expensive engagement ring I'd noticed in his desk drawer, but had somehow rationalized away. When I confronted him about it, he claimed it was for me. That we needed to wait for the right time until his situation was completely resolved. "I want to do this properly, Sarah," he said, pulling me into his arms. "You deserve a real proposal, a real relationship. Not something hidden and complicated. Just give me a little more time." But his promises were becoming more vague, more distant. And our therapy sessions had completely devolved into these weird hybrid encounters where we'd start talking about my mental health and end up having sex on his couch. I wasn't getting better. If anything, I was getting worse, more anxious, more dependent, more confused about what was real and what wasn't. I felt like I was losing my mind, but I was so deep into this relationship, so emotionally invested that I couldn't see a way out. Marcus had become my whole world, and the thought of losing him felt like it would destroy me completely. In early April, my friend Emma called me with an invitation that would change everything. Emma was one of those people who seemed to know everyone in the city. Wealthy, connected, always getting invited to exclusive events that the rest of us could only dream about. "Sarah, you have to come with me to this party," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "It's going to be the social event of the season. This billionaire tech mogul is throwing an engagement party for himself and his fiancée, and apparently it's going to be absolutely incredible. I'm talking mansion, live orchestra, celebrities, the works." Normally, I would have made an excuse. Social events like that intimidated me, especially when I was already feeling so fragile and anxious. But Marcus had been particularly distant that week, claiming he was dealing with business complications, and I thought maybe getting out and networking would be good for me. Maybe it would help me remember who I was outside of this complicated relationship. The guy's name is Marcus Reed, Emma continued. Ever heard of him? He's apparently this super successful entrepreneur who owns a bunch of companies. Total mystery man. Keeps a really low profile, but word is he's worth billions. My heart stopped. Marcus Reed. It had to be a coincidence, right? My Marcus was a therapist, not a billionaire tech mogul. But the name? It couldn't be random. What kind of companies does he own? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Oh, all sorts of things. Real estate, tech startups, medical practices. The guy's got his fingers in everything. But like I said, he's super private. This is the first big public event he's ever thrown. Medical practices. My hands started shaking as pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed began falling into place. I agreed to go to the party, telling myself I was being paranoid. That there were probably dozens of Marcus Reeds in the city. That my therapist and this mysterious billionaire just happened to share a name. But deep down, some part of me already knew the truth. Some part of me had always known something wasn't right. The party was at this incredible mansion in the hills, the kind of place you see in movies about the ultra-wealthy. Emma and I arrived in her car, following a line of Bentleys and Ferraris up a winding drive. The house itself was like something out of a fairy tale, massive, all glass and stone, with lights twinkling in every window. Inside was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, flowers everywhere that probably cost more than my annual salary. There were easily 300 people there, all dressed to the nines, all clearly wealthy and important. I felt completely out of place in my department store dress, but Emma pulled me along. I was the secret he'd been keeping, the lie he'd been living, standing there in his perfect new life like a reminder of everything he'd done wrong. I don't remember moving, but somehow I found myself walking toward him through the crowd, my legs moving on autopilot while my brain tried to process what was happening. People were congratulating him, shaking his hand, toasting his happiness, and he was smiling and thanking them while his eyes kept darting to me in complete panic. When I finally reached him, he grabbed my arm and pulled me aside, away from the crowd. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" he whispered urgently. "How did you? You can't be here. Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of my heart breaking. "Who the hell are you really?" That's when everything came tumbling out. The truth I should have seen from the beginning but had been too blinded by my own neediness to recognize. Marcus Reed wasn't just a therapist. He owned the therapy practice. He owned dozens of businesses. He was exactly who Emma had said he was. A billionaire entrepreneur who'd built an empire from nothing. And Victoria, his fiancée, wasn't some random girlfriend he was planning to leave. She was his business partner, his equal, the woman he'd been with for 8 years and was about to marry in front of 300 of their closest friends and family members. The therapy practice wasn't his passion project. It was his hunting ground. How many others have there been? I asked, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. How many other patients have you done this to? The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen. I was just the latest in a long line of vulnerable women he'd manipulated and used. Standing there in that beautiful ballroom, surrounded by the evidence of his real life, I finally saw Marcus Reed for who he truly was. Not the caring therapist who'd helped me heal. Not the complicated man struggling with a difficult relationship, but a predator who used his position of power to exploit women at their most vulnerable moments. And I'd fallen for it completely. In that moment of devastating clarity, standing in the middle of Marcus's engagement party, while he begged me to leave quietly and not ruin everything, I could have done a lot of things. I could have screamed. I could have caused a scene. I could have run away and spent the rest of my life wondering what if. Instead, I did something that surprised even myself. I smiled. "Congratulations on your engagement, Dr. Reed," I said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "I'm sure Victoria is a very lucky woman." The panic in his eyes was delicious. He clearly had no idea what I was planning, but he knew me well enough to know I wasn't going to just disappear quietly into the night. I spent the next hour circulating through the party, being charming and social in a way I hadn't been in months. I met Victoria's parents, her business colleagues, Marcus's family members. I listened to story after story about their perfect relationship, their shared dreams, their bright future together. And with every conversation, my resolve grew stronger. Because here's what Marcus didn't know. I'd been recording our therapy sessions from the very beginning. Not for any sinister reason, but because I'd read that keeping audio records of your therapy could help you process things between sessions. I had hours and hours of recordings on my phone, including sessions where Marcus had talked about his girlfriend's situation, where he'd made promises about leaving her, where he'd crossed professional boundaries in ways that were clearly unethical and probably illegal. I also had text messages. Lots of them. Screenshots of every inappropriate conversation we'd ever had, evidence of him soliciting a relationship with a patient, proof of the affair we'd been having for months. And most importantly, I had realized something that night that gave me the final piece of leverage I needed. Marcus had mentioned other patients in our conversations, never by name but with enough detail that I could probably identify them if I tried. Which meant I wasn't his only victim. There were other women out there who'd been through what I'd been through, who'd trusted him with their mental health and had that trust violated in the most intimate way possible. I found Victoria during a quiet moment, when she'd stepped away from the crowd to touch up her makeup in a side room. She was everything I wasn't: tall, blonde, elegant, successful. The kind of woman who belonged in a mansion like this, who could stand beside a billionaire as an equal rather than as a victim. "Victoria," I said softly, closing the door behind me. "My name is Sarah. I think we need to talk." She looked confused but not alarmed. "I'm sorry, do we know each other? Are you one of Marcus's business associates?" "Not exactly," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'm one of his patients. Or rather, I was. Until we started sleeping together." The color drained from her face, but she didn't deny it or get angry. She just sat down heavily in a nearby chair and said, "Show me." So I did. I played her selected recordings, showed her text messages, explained the timeline of our affair, and how it had overlapped with Marcus's planning of this very party. I watched this strong, successful woman crumble as she realized that the man she'd loved for 8 years, the man she built a business empire with, had been systematically betraying her with vulnerable patients. "There are others," I told her gently. "From things he said, I know I'm not the first. And if we don't stop this, I won't be the last." Victoria was quiet for a long time, processing everything I told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and determined. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you to help me make sure this never happens again," I said. "And I need you to understand that you deserve so much better than this." What happened next was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. Victoria stood up, smoothed down her designer gown, and walked back into the party with her head held high. She made her way to the front of the room where Marcus was mingling with guests, tapped a champagne glass to get everyone's attention, and began to speak. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight to celebrate what we thought was going to be the beginning of a new chapter in Marcus's and my life together," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Unfortunately, I've just learned some information that changes everything." I watched from the back of the room as Marcus's face went white, as he realized what was about to happen but was powerless to stop it. It turns out that the man I was planning to marry has been using his position as a therapist to exploit vulnerable women," Victoria continued, her voice never wavering. "Women who trusted him with their mental health and their deepest secrets. Women who came to him for help, and instead were manipulated into inappropriate relationships." The room was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. "So instead of celebrating an engagement tonight, we're going to be celebrating something else," Victoria said, looking directly at Marcus. "We're going to be celebrating the truth. And the truth is that Marcus Reed is a predator who doesn't deserve to be in a position of power over anyone, let alone vulnerable people seeking help." She turned to address the crowd again. "The engagement is off. The wedding is canceled. And I'll be spending the next few months working with the authorities to make sure that Marcus never has the opportunity to hurt anyone else the way he's hurt me and his patients." Then she walked out of the room, leaving Marcus standing there in front of 300 guests who now knew exactly what kind of man he really was. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a week, I'd filed a complaint with the state medical board, providing them with all the evidence I'd collected. Victoria, who it turned out was not just Marcus's fiancée but also the majority shareholder in his business empire, fired him from every company he'd thought he owned. Other victims came forward. 5 other women who'd had similar experiences with Marcus over the years. He lost his medical license. He lost his businesses. He lost his reputation, his wealth, his standing in the community. The man who'd thought he was untouchable, who'd believed he could manipulate and use people without consequences, discovered that karma has a way of catching up with everyone eventually. 6 months later, I was sitting in the office of a real therapist. A woman this time, someone who came highly recommended and had no connection to Marcus or his practice. I was actually healing, actually working through my issues in a healthy, appropriate way. The anxiety that had brought me to Marcus in the first place was manageable now, controlled through proper therapy and medication and self-care. Victoria and I had become unlikely friends. She'd thrown herself into advocacy work, helping other victims of professional abuse, and working to strengthen regulations around therapist-patient relationships. She'd kept Marcus's business empire but transformed it into something positive, something that actually helped people instead of exploiting them. As for Marcus himself, I ran into him completely by accident at a coffee shop downtown. He was working behind the counter, wearing a name tag and a stained apron, taking orders from customers who had no idea they were being served by a former billionaire. When he saw me, his eyes filled with recognition and something that might have been shame. I ordered my usual, a large coffee with oat milk, and when he handed it to me, our fingers brushed for just a moment. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, maybe apologize or try to explain himself. But I just took my coffee, left a tip, and walked away without saying a word. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or angry words. Sometimes it's simply moving on, healing, and living a better life than the person who tried to destroy you. Sometimes karma is just knowing that while you're thriving, they're exactly where they deserve to be. Can you believe the audacity of some people? If this story taught me anything, it's that karma always finds a way. What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more incredible true stories like this, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next week.